Hello, welcome to this online edition of Transformation Digital Art. Welcome to the second day of this symposium. My name is Gaby Wijers and I'm director of LIMA. And LIMA is an international pioneer and center of expertise in the fields of archiving, preservation and distribution of media art. We are located in Amsterdam, but even more important, we are a network organization. Our approach is anchored within a multidisciplinary network, both nationally and internationally. In collaboration with museums and artists, activists and archivists, academies and universities, we research and develop methods and practices and services and tools to be able to deal with digital art in a sustainable way, supporting both artists and institutions. Yesterday's presentations and discussions on issues we are all facing is sustaining our digital heritage for the future generations. They showed clearly the relevance of our approach and shows us the importance of envisioning and creating collaboration and lasting infrastructures of care. This symposium is a platform to present state-of-the-art preservation projects and approaches for the conservation of software-based art, to exchange and gain knowledge, to support and connect. In performance and digital art, documentation has become the focus of conservation and presentation strategies. New artistic practices do challenge existing forms of documentation, resulting in new ways of thinking about documentation. And that's why this year's focus is on documenting digital art, rethinking histories and practices of documentation in the museum and beyond. We will show and discuss practices and strategies for documentation, transmission, and preservation of digital art for and by artists, curators, researchers, and conservators. And the whole day or the whole evening will revolve around the question, what can be learned from practices within and without the scope of the museum? Today, we start with the rise of documentation by Annet Dekker, followed by a workshop with Centre Pompidou, short projects presentations, and artists, researchers, curators, Black and Francesca Franco in discussion with moderator Shailoh Phillips. The symposium is part of the project Documentation Digital Art, and Annet Dekker is one of the main project researchers and will talk about the increasing attention to and value of documentation. I'm happy to hand over to her. Annet, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Gaby, and thank you all for watching us. I'm looking forward to sharing my story with you. So first of all, share my screen and see how that goes. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you a story with images, based on images and about images. More precisely, a story based on and about curating documentation. I'm sharing this story in order to figure out how much fun curating documentation is, why it's important to document, and to explore the paradox in documenting digital art. The paradox comes down to a tension between the changing artwork and the static documentation. But instead of arguing, as some do, for the undocumentability of digital art, I'm interested in bringing out the potential of this paradox. I'll begin by looking at how documentation is produced, created, used in and beyond the institutional. And it's quite clear that documentation is created and used in different ways and functions differently, yet also complementary, if all goes well. So conservators create documentation to explore and digest what it is the artwork consists of, in order for it to be preserved, restored, and presented in the future. They try to optimize their documentation workflows by creating detailed descriptions, visualizations, mappings of all the elements of an artwork, carefully detailing all the links, dependencies, processes, and performances. Curators tend to approach documentation as a tool to present and explain the context or parts of an artwork, often based on traditional models of institutional cultural authority and disciplinary expertise. Marketing makes and uses documentation to sell or explain the activities that are organized, even if unwanted. Educators use documentation to illustrate and deepen the meaning of art. Artists don't only create, but also document their work, at times making it part of another presentation or turning it into a new artwork altogether. Visitors to the museum document their experience and make it part of the online circulation of images by sharing it on online social media platforms. Here, documentation becomes part of identity construction, while it enters an intricate ecosystem of likes, reposts, algorithms, bots, and other humans that all validate and evaluate the documentation. Finally, researchers try to make sense of the documentation. They try to dig deeper into the mechanics of the image, trying to find clues in the EXIF data, or alternatively, or in parallel, they try to make sense of this circulation of documentation. Indeed, it's about a year ago now. I was scrolling my Instagram feed in a moment of procrastination, yet always looking for documentation efforts. I noticed Jonas Lund's Instagram post, which she posted just a few weeks before my presentation at the then planned Transformation Digital Art Symposium. Quickly, I made a screen capture, as I thought it would be a good example to illustrate my point. The following day, my fellow colleague, Katrina Sluis, speaking here tomorrow, sends me her screen capture of the same, but slightly different part of the Instagram post. I shared mine with her, and she joked, "Oh, Meta, audience documentation of art is documentation of audience documentation." Indeed, how far can we take this? Several questions come up when considering these different approaches to documentation. How much do these different practices know of each other? How much of what they do is circulated? Do they look at all at each other's practices? In what way does it perhaps influence their work and the value of documentation? Or should it? Indeed, what is the value of documentation? Where is it stored? How is it kept? Or by whom is it looked at? What is the relation between documentation and the documented object or event? What happens when documentation becomes part of the installation of the artwork? Or, if it is the only remaining trace, does it substitute the artwork or perhaps becomes a new artwork? Is documentation a copy? And if so, can it still have an aura? Does it provide added value to the original? As interesting as these questions are, today I can merely take a first step, and I will start by focusing on my own practice, and particularly the way I looked at documentation. I've been searching for several examples of exhibitions I curated in the past, and I want to investigate the usefulness of their documentation in order to then unpack the value of documentation. So going back in time, perhaps before I start, a few words that are necessary to explain my relation to curating digital art. When selecting artworks to be presented, I've always been interested in types of works that are somehow performative, that change, those that allow the visitor, or better the user, to explore certain themes, spaces, or thoughts, guided by some markers, links, objects, or directives. In the exhibition you see here, My Story, I wanted to emphasize the multiple ways of telling stories, how stories are not merely moving from A to Z, but how the nonlinear, that has been emphasized again by the digital, provides space, in a literal sense, as in Sayar's work, as well as conceptually, as in Tabaima's work. Her ideas about the presentation of her work in relation to its content explain very well my own interest in presenting art. She says, what interests me is the idea of setting up a space, be it narrow, dark, or on a slope, somewhere where it's not easy to stand, somewhere which makes a variety of demands on how you approach it. Basically, an environment which denies you a comfortable viewing experience. I think the viewer's stories themselves are the work. So by making the work together, in a sense, by setting up spaces which causes the viewer discomfort, spaces which have elements in them that need to be overcome, the work become a participatory experience. I think by subverting those preconceptions, it makes it possible for viewers to ask why things are the way they are and search for the answer to that question. This notion of subversion couldn't be more clear than in the work by Jody. And not only in their artworks, but also in their presentations. They try to come up with new ways to engage visitors in unexpected ways, and curators, as well as documenters, or those doing documentation. After 2 weeks of building, in 2005, a successful opening happened and a video of the exhibition was made. A few days later, I walked into our building and was greeted by the person at the front desk who approached me in a somewhat uncomfortable and uncertain way, telling me that Jody had been there a few days before and they changed some things in the exhibition. They removed the work and they reordered some of the setup in the installation of another work. I think it worked well, but the resulting change was not documented. Clearly, when talking about change, there's much to learn from live art, performance art, and net art. So a year later, in 2005, I organized Resonance, an exhibition about the remains of a performance or how to translate a live performance into a gallery space. Some years later, I had a chance to organize an exhibition at the Stedelijk Museumbureau Amsterdam, which was about the artist's creative response to the influence of computer algorithms, or what some may now call digital curation. Although not necessarily intentional, documentation became central in this exhibition because most of the works were either research-driven, performative, or didn't have a fixed way to be exhibited, be it smartphone, a dull media box, or a marketing campaign. Interestingly, while documentation in the sense of translation has played an important role in the presentations of the exhibitions I've organized, finding actually some images to illustrate this point to you today turned out to be much harder than I hoped for. So to give you some insight, here's the story of my search for documentation of David Still and his re-performance as part of the exhibition Resonance. My first step was to look in the depths of my computer, which merely provided me with some text, a few images, and those were actually used for publicity before the exhibition actually took place. My next hope was the internet. Recently, I learned also from Aga Wilocha, conservator at Plus in Hong Kong, and someone who just successfully defended her PhD, in which she makes a very convincing and urgent plea to recognize the value of documentation. She mentioned that often museum employees' first choice when looking for images of a particular piece from their collection is also the internet, as opposed to their own databases. Indeed, much works is, as she mentioned, partially accessible to the public, even when not installed, through imagery available on the internet. Yet, for some reason, this wealth of online documentation is hardly collected or even acknowledged and referenced in museums, discourses, and art history. In the meantime, scrolling the web, I was going down memory lane and nearly distracted, I stumbled upon an image of all the designs that were made of the events we organized, which brought me back to my task, finding documentation about David Still. And so I thought the designer must have everything because he participated in the production of the presentation of the work. Alas, as she also regrets not to have kept much at all. So next to the unavailability of documentation, or the original artwork for that matter, there are several challenges with documentation, most of which I'm sure you've witnessed already in my poorly illustrated story. So here a quick summary. Yet despite the many challenges, documentation is also of course valuable for many reasons, as Gabriela yesterday already showed, but also as mentioned by Boris Groves. In the case of art documentation as an art form, it's not the making of any finished artwork that is documented. Rather, documentation becomes the sole result of art, which is understood as a form of life, a duration, a production of history. Moreover, he continues, art documentation shows how the living can be replaced by the artificial and how the artificial can be made living by means of a narrative. Although this quote remains somewhat abstract, something similar is argued by Becky Edmonds, a specialist dance videographer who also worked extensively with blast theory, as I'm sure we might hear actually from Matt Adams later today. As a videographer, Edmonds tries to enjoy the gap between the live and the recorded by providing small pieces of information through which a viewer might be able to actively reconstruct an imagined version, myth, or memory of what that event might have been. Edmonds is not interested in providing the viewer with an authentic recording. And by showing actually quite restricted views or small glimpses of the action, she draws attention to the gaps that documentation creates. Edmonds is not trying to convey how the artist wants her to document the work. Rather, she engages with the work as being inside and part of it, instead of being a neutral outsider. Indeed, and obviously, any form of documentation will be a substitute to the original. But perhaps there are other ways of thinking about documentation. So the question I once posed, can or should documents evoke its absent object or event, or would it be enough to provide an impression or translate the atmosphere? Is it possible to think of an expanded understanding of documentation as preservation? Can easily be answered by yes. Moreover, though, such thinking allows documentation to develop as a critical space in its own right, where the issues and concerns of the work are addressed through appropriate forms without necessarily becoming reproduction. So, considering documentation and documenting as important aspects of an artwork, such a process, which can be as creative and as challenging as the live event, can be thought of as a form of a dialogue, a reflection and a response, which can be used both as a tool in the creative process and as something containing tacit knowledge. Yet while such documentation can perhaps be seen as a sort of boundary object, passing between communities where it faces different interpretive strategies in each one, there is one thing that kept me busy over all these years. Documentation is still static. Despite everything that it can evoke, there is another tension between the artwork and its documentation, which is that the document is much more static than the artwork that it tried to document. As I indeed briefly mentioned in the beginning, artworks change, and usually several iterations of a presentation exist. Yet the documentation becomes an object and remains static. It doesn't change, it just captures one moment in time. So how to overcome this challenge? How to consider and think through documentation in a way that it becomes less static, or as Groys argued, can be made living, and in the process do also more justice to the work that it documented. So let's return to the documentation, to the exhibition Algorithmic Rubbish, where, as I mentioned, most of the art was presented through its documentation of ideas, research, or experiments. And let's zoom in on one of the works, the Novice Art Blogger by Matthew Plummer Fernandez. Novice Art Blogger was an automated bot that generated captions for the abstract paintings in the online collection of the Stedelijk Museum. The captions and an image from the painting were shared on Tumblr and redistributed on other social media platforms. So the challenge became how to present this in the gallery. In discussions between the artist, the curator of the gallery, Jelle Bauhaus, and myself, we decided that it would be great to hang the original paintings in the gallery space, accompanied by their new captions. A great idea, but of course with many limitations, not in the least relating to transport, temperature regulations, insurance, and well, I'll stop here. The next best thing was to hang reproductions of the paintings and frame those, as well as spread them throughout the city on large posters. In the end, due to time restrictions to make all the arrangements and clear any of the formalities that had to be taken, and the limited budget we had at our disposal, we made photocopies that were put up next to each other in the gallery, together with their new labels. And well, clearly these photos doesn't really capture the main challenges, or actually captures really well the challenges of documenting it. However, though, what interests me is how, as formulated by Matthew here, how Novice Art Blogger is not commenting on the original artworks, but on digital photographic reproductions. The interpretation of reproduced artworks is further removed from its context. The software has no understanding of the author, period, style, history, and other contextualizing elements. The artbot doesn't see the original materiality of the artwork, neither paint nor brushstrokes. Instead, it has a grid of pixels to process, a substrate for visual art that would be alien to some of the original authors of these artworks. So here we see the documentation of a translation of a translation. I guess we're back to the meta. When considering the implications of using the artbot for documentation, something else that Matthew remarks is really relevant, I think. And he says artbots are a valuable contribution to storytelling and the realization of those stories through diegetic jet working prototypes developed, deployed in the public sphere for others to encounter. Indeed, it's these framings that could potentially lead to new insights, or as Groys mentioned, here the artbots show how the living can be replaced by the artificial and how the artificial can be made living by means of a narrative. So to dwell a little bit more on the power of the narrative, or as mentioned by Matthew here, the power of storytelling. Well, clearly these artbots create their own challenges. They are transparent enough to make clear their own mechanical nature, showing that both their virtues and failures, leaving the users free to swivel between the story and the construction of the story, dipping in and out of suspended disbelief, balancing enjoyment with intelligibility and imagination. Storytelling as a method in preservation is something that has attracted my attention in the past years. Yet recently it gained momentum when trying to design a book that took 10 years to become a reality. Well, a near reality, not until June. And as the title suggests, it's about curating digital art. Next to a contextual essay and an extensive timeline of online exhibitions, the book is primarily a collection of interviews with curators, artists, and designers about curating digital art. Most of them curate both offline in physical space and online on the web. It's the web that confronted me again with the challenges of documentation, not only because of the difficulty of finding or creating documentation, but particularly due to the static nature or lifelessness of documentation. Now, one of the aims of the book is to tell stories, which happens through the interviews, but could it also happen through the images, through its documentation? Showing a selection of images to the designer, all of us realized that they didn't communicate much. These were renderings, images, screenshots without meaning by themselves. Yet here, the more, the better works. Slowly jumping your eye between the images connects them and creates meaning. Like André Malraux, Musée Imaginaire, the images start to perform. The interaction, performativity, and processes were all lost in the freeze of a single and tiny screenshot, but in its multiplicity, it gained value. Indeed, the power of the screenshot is in its multiplicity, sharing and circulation. Another example that I want to show, because I think it shows this process really well, is Olia Lialina and Dragan Espenschied's project, 1 terabyte of kilobyte age. In an attempt to revive a lost and forgotten world on the web, GeoCities, Olia and Dragan decided to use popular formats, a screenshot of the homepage of each GeoCities website, and the post as the contemporary means of communication, circulation on social media platforms. So the screenshots are posted every 20 minutes on a Tumblr and end up in Twitter, Well, they were liked, reposted again and again. Taking advantage of crappy documentation and intense circulation, the vernacular web of GeoCities was reborn. But how can such a project be presented in a gallery or in a book in a way perverting its nature? Well, we can, through translation, adaptation, appropriation, and addressing the medium that fits the intentions of the artist, the artwork, and the contemporary context best, be it flipbooks, stickers, slide projectors. Indeed, documentation can be damaging. As a homogeneous image or a video file, it does not do justice to the work it tries to present. But documentation can function through multiplicity, human users and computer bots. It's by looking at and mimicking how the artwork functions through ambiguity, performance, processes, and networks that documentation comes alive. Now, if you're curious what my presentation would have been like last year, you can go over here and read all about it. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, going over to my other hat this evening, I have to announce that we have a changeover where some people might be going to the workshops, and other of you that are not going to the workshops might be coming back here at 19:45, 7:45, where we have more presentations, more discussions to follow up. More information below here on your YouTube channel, on Facebook, and of course the LIMA website. Looking forward to reading all about your questions, comments, feedback, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.